Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Ditloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico. Folks, I've been traveling. I'm a jet setter, I'm a world traveler, and that's exciting for me. Last weekend, I took a real quick trip to Belfast in Northern Ireland. I might as well since I'm over here in these great islands. And while I was there, I learned a lot about Irish republicanism, Protestantism as well. Just generally the troubles and also the big tangle of factors that were at play throughout the height of the struggle in Northern Ireland throughout the, I guess, latter half of the 20th century. Throughout the trip, I kept hearing and seeing all kinds of things about the ways that religion is at least one of the many factors driving the big conflict in Northern Ireland. And that led me to wonder exactly how liberation theology might have impacted the priests and the lay people of Northern Ireland throughout the 70s and the various movements that were part of the peace process into the 90s and even into the 2000s a bit. My brain is such that if I'm in any place and I hear of something social struggle oriented or political struggle oriented in the 70s, I go, I wonder how liberation theology played a role in this. Dean, is your brain similarly warped? Is this what you do too when you go places?
It is similarly warped, and I mean that's why we're such good friends, because Matt was immediately sending me pictures of Oscar Romero murals and so on, and I appreciate that. And while Matt was there, I immediately just started Googling Ireland in quotes and liberation theology in quotes, just trying to figure out what's going on. And I mean, it's no surprise, right? Especially when you have a Catholic country and a country that has lots of missionaries and so on, like Ireland. There's got to be some links.
There's got to be some links. I'm sure that there is a deep history of liberation theology and Ireland, and specifically Northern Ireland, I guess, as I was interested in it. But when it comes down to it, the link is actually a pretty hard one to parse out. I guess it's not as obvious as you might think it is. I think that there's a lot of different ways these two things coalesce and play off one another, cross-pollination or whatever, to use a biological metaphor. But it's not one that is super stark. So while many Irish priests and nuns, like you just said, Dean, did do missionary work in Latin America at the time, it didn't generate a clear set of canonical texts like liberation theology did in Latin America. You get the theology of liberation. You get all of Hugo Assmann's stuff and Henk Lamar and all these guys writing their big books, their big Orbis books, their big, beautiful Mary Knoll books. And there are, don't get me wrong, there are books in Ireland. They've got them there. But there's not a clear canon of key theological, liberation theology texts, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Or if there are, I haven't found them yet. And I've looked kind of hard. There's a few, and we'll talk about maybe a few of them here in a minute. But all that being said, there are records of theological conferences and talks in Ireland where some cranky conservative theologians are really upset about the acceptance of liberation theology by some of their colleagues. So we know that kind of cross-pollination does exist, and that's a cool thing to find out about. But despite definitive writing on the subject and not having a clear big book that just says here's some stuff about liberation theology in Ireland, there are a lot of traces of that type of theology that you can see pretty clearly in the lives of a lot of the priests who worked as negotiators between the oppositional and rival factions in places like Belfast. I'm pretty Belfast-pilled this week. Belfast, okay, let me just give you a quick few sentences about the city. It's such a cool place. If you ever get the opportunity, definitely go. It's not a very big city in terms of it's not like an American city, I guess. It's just a little city. It's really beautiful and interesting, and there's lots of cool history. They've got a really great museum about the Titanic. I did like that a lot. But interestingly enough, is you can kind of still see the marks of the anti-Catholic, I guess, segregation. I guess that's what you'd call it, in Northern Ireland, where there were there was a literal wall dividing Catholic and Protestant communities from one another. I guess that's as segregationist as it gets. So anyways, really fascinating place to be. Definitely a place to visit if you've never been. Worth it. Go be a tourist and check it out. It's pretty fun.
On the traces bit, I guess we'll probably come back to this later in the episode, but speaking of just kind of looking at the signs of struggle or kind of what's left over and so on, a long time ago when Matt and I were researching global connections with a few movements like Christians for Socialism and the kind of general Catholic left experience around the world, we did find a bunch of pretty interesting signs of liberation theology activity in addition to those kinds of conferences. Like, we had found different announcements of, for example, like, this priest is going to talk on a stage with some leaders of, socialist movements in Ireland about Christianity and socialism and so on. So that kind of stuff was happening, and those people were clearly invested in Latin America and what was coming out of Chile and that sort of thing. So that's clear. And there's also kind of almost like proto-liberation theology movements in Ireland. So, for example, I went back, people who listen to this podcast for a very long time might remember we did an episode forever ago about this journal or magazine called Grill, which was a Catholic left publication in Ireland in the 60s. And I was looking at this issue that we have a PDF of from 1968, and it's super fascinating. It's talking about like Black Power and Catholicism. It's talking about the Civil Rights Movement. It's talking about imperialism and Catholicism and socialism and Cuba and all kinds of other stuff. But the fact that it's published in 68 is so fascinating because that is also the year that I'm pretty sure that's when Gutierrez publishes A Theology of Liberation. But there's, it's too early for that to have had like a massive impact. But you see this kind of like, I guess, intuition of the same sorts of themes just by virtue of, I guess, living as Catholics under a situation of oppression and exploitation. So all that to say, like, the seeds are there, and I think it's very cool. And the thing that I liked most about your trip to Belfast, Matt, experiencing it vicariously through you, is all the ways in which things are expressed in the city, like through murals of solidarity. I mentioned this great picture of a mural of Oscar Romero. So when you were talking about Belfast, it just kind of triggered that there are all these really interesting like tells that there's something going on there, and definitely a history of like shared consciousness and struggle, even if there's not a big book called, Ireland and Liberation Theology or something like that.
It is a good thing to recognize too that the journal that you were just talking about from 1968. It's worth pulling that out because I think the American civil rights movement actually probably had I don't want to say a bigger impact than liberation theology, but definitely like in a lot of ways that the Catholic social movements kind of took shape. The American civil rights movement had like a lot of impact in that way. So all that to say, there's a lot of different factors kind of bleeding into things here. To maybe recap all of this, we're going to talk about Northern Ireland. We're going to talk about Ireland. They're two different countries in case you didn't know. And we're going to talk about the ways that Christianity specifically played an active role in the, I guess, process of segregation and also the process of peace. One of those great dualities of Christianity episodes that you've got going on here. It's the bad guy and the good guy all at once. But before we jump into like the liberation theology piece exactly, and maybe some of the specifics about what's going on in Ireland, I've written up probably a very haphazard but quick overview of conflict in Ireland. And I've done this at my own risk, I suppose, of getting something really wrong, but I did it because I think it's important to at least lay out some of these like key beats in the story so that you could understand exactly why the conflict is taking place and like why it sort of like cycles in the way that it does. There's a lot of moving parts in history, and especially the big chunk of history that I've chosen here to talk about. And I've also I'm going to stop apologizing for myself. I'm not an expert on this, but like all I'm trying to say is that if I overlook something or I miss out on a key detail or you think I've mischaracterized something, I apologize in advance. You can write me a mean tweet or whatever. That's fine. So Ireland is not just a place, but it's two places, I think is really important to say. We've got the Republic of Ireland and we've got Northern Ireland. But before all of that, it's so hard to even start figuring out where you should talk about like the beginning of the story. There's a few different beginnings that maybe you could talk about. I don't know. It's a lot of different kings, a lot of different like uprisings. It's so much. But here's one thing that we can say. Ireland was a part of the British Empire from January 1st, 1801 until December 6th, 1922. And there's like some wiggle room in exactly the specificity of these dates, but they do correspond to particular things in general. So Ireland was officially part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, not Northern Ireland as it is today. And in a letter from Engels to Marx, Engels commented that Ireland was England's first colony, which, again, I don't know. I guess that's, if Engels says it's true, it probably is. But
Well, there's an interesting bit even about that in Cedric Robinson's stuff on racial capitalism, where he talks about how like the categories of race are invented before the categories of blackness, which is kind of his way of being like, capitalism produces a racializing logic and maybe vice versa. But he says Ireland is kind of the laboratory for like racialized thinking to be coupled with the emergence of what would be industrial capitalism. And he points to the demarcation of Irish people and Catholics in particular as like a proto-racializing logic. So all that to say, Engels is saying it. Cedric Robinson is saying it. I mean, what more do you need? A lot of people are saying it.
Okay. Engels, Cedric Robinson, and now me. Us three. We've agreed. So important. So the history, though, with Ireland and the United Kingdom and colonialism is a deep history. That is what I'm trying to say. One place that we can start talking about this history is with what are called the Ulster Protestants. Ireland, a Catholic country from the beginning, from the ground up, right? That's something that we all probably know. But the United Kingdom, especially after the Reformation, not a Catholic country, and did not want Catholics having control over the country. That would be bad for them. In the 1600s, King James initiated a push for colonization to establish British and Protestant rule in Ireland through the dispossession of native Irish Catholics from the land. It's capitalism doing what it always does, right? It's sending in colonists, it's dispossessing a handful of people from their land, separating them from it, and then taking that land as their own. So from the 1600s on, there were a number of uprisings and rebellions stemming from this initial act of like dispossession, the primitive accumulation of capital. You might call it that as well. Agriculture, land, and economic imperialism, these three things, they are like the central points of tension in the relationship between the Irish and the British, between Ireland and England. The United Kingdom, I guess, more widely, but the relationship between all the other countries in the United Kingdom is also tense and complicated and deserves its own conversation that I don't have time to give right now. Through the 1800s, jumping forward 200 years, through the 1800s, Ireland suffered a really awful famine. You might have heard of it. In fact, I'm sure you have. It was a massive blight on their potato crop, and it caused the mass immigration of people, but also mass death of people. And there's a lot of really interesting critical historians. There's a lot of really interesting critical histories about the famine, the potato famine in Ireland. And a lot of people, even today, I think like regular people, will kind of be up in arms with whether or not you might call this type of thing a genocide. And I think that's a really interesting question, especially given the ever-evolving discourse on genocide with regards to Palestine and Israel and how that all plans out here. I did kind of look up some takes on this because I was really fascinated in, I guess, my own right, just as a guy learning about Ireland when I was there. But in a book called The Great Famine, Ireland's Agony by Kieran O'Murta, I'm probably saying that guy's name wrong, which I apologize, but I'm an American. I'm so sorry. Anyways, the author says, if genocide is taken to signify the deliberate systemic annihilation of an entire ethnic religious group by mass murder, there's no 19th century equivalent that applies anywhere. Meaning that like that's not exactly what happens. If that's what you mean by genocide, that's not exactly what's going on with the potato famine in Ireland. However, if it's defined as a deliberate systemic use of an environmental catastrophe to destroy people under the pretext of engineering social reform, then there's certainly a case to be made about genocide here. So anyways, an interesting note about the famine in Ireland. It is a genocide in that sense of the word, and maybe less so in the other sense, but an important thing to note as we're kind of getting along here. These tensions, again, like they don't ever go away. They're not like resolved in any kind of like peace and reconciliation or something. It's just bad, and it continues to get worse. So during this time, right, there's a famine, there's the mass dispossession. This is like, hundreds of years kind of in happening. There's mass diaspora, there's immigration and so on, right? Also, like throughout this entire situation, the British Empire is trying to find ways to make sure that like the Catholics don't ever kind of get back on top in terms of like the social order. So throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Catholics are banned from things like owning land, holding elected seats in parliament, or like higher military office. Catholics are also banned from things like voting, all kinds of really bad stuff. It's segregationism for sure, right? Exactly in the way that you mentioned earlier about Cedric Robinson. A great note for sure. So the tensions in Ireland between Catholic and Protestant and Irish and British seem pretty clear. The lines are not murky whatsoever. And it's in this long history of tensions and injustices that would motivate the initial and eventual forming of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Irish Citizen Army that led to the Easter Rising insurrection in 1916. There's like a gazillion years of things I'm missing along the way, but this is like the other thing that people care about, or this is like the part that's like sort of romanticized in like TV miniseries is the Easter Rising. You get figures like James Connolly and all kinds of other great guys. We did do an episode about James Connolly a long time ago with Brett O'Shea of the Revolutionary Left Radio podcast.
And we also did a cool episode on the Easter Rising with Greg Daly, an Irish journalist who did a really interesting little book about Catholicism in the Easter Rising. So lots of great content back there in the archives.
Oh man, that's right. I completely forgot about that episode. That's cool. We'll repost it. It's good. It's good stuff. I guess what I'm trying to say in kind of like telling the story in this way is that there are these like sort of segregationist policies. There is the weaponization of a famine against a whole population of people. And that does not, and the way that those tensions get resolved is through violence, is through the formation of some socialist kinds of revolutionary violence, and then some just like less socialist and more nationalist. And that's a distinction that ends up being a pretty big deal later on as well. It's also these like same tensions, that are happening in 1916 that lead to the formation of and the splintering of the Irish Republican Army, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and a bunch of other these like different factions throughout the 20th century. There's so many of them. I'm not going to pretend like I know all of them, but these tensions, like, they don't go away. They're there, they're present, and they erupt pretty regularly into some type of protest movements, into like paramilitary groups, and also into reaction from the police and from the British government as well. So there's like violence happening here all over the place, not just like on the side of like the Catholics. I guess we should probably be clear about that. Part of these early 19th century conflicts in Ireland was a movement called Home Rule. This is kind of, again, talking about the early 1900s. Home Rule was a movement that would give Ireland a devolved government with a degree of independence from the UK. The Protestants didn't like that because home rule, as they would say, meant Rome rule. So that's like the ever present threat in Ireland when it comes to home rule and a devolved government. Is that means that that means the Catholics are in charge, and puts Protestants into question, I guess. So from 1912,
just like JFK,
exactly, just like JFK. Just like all the secret Jesuits really running the United States government. From 1912 to 1914, the call for home rule by Irish nationalists, Catholics, and Republicans, and sometimes different takes on these things and different degrees and so on, not a uniform sort of expression all the time. It led to big reaction from the Protestant population of Northern Ireland. Through the formation of Protestant paramilitaries, all kinds of different groups kind of erupting and forming and provoking. You can't have Catholics and Republicans and all these other folks running around here saying they want their own government without loyalists and unionists and Protestants saying something in defense or taking up arms in defense. So violence between the nationalists and the unionists would continue, and it spun out into the War of Irish Independence, as you can imagine. So later, again, skipping over a big chunk of history, later in 1922, there's a truce that's called, and that truce ends up leading to the partition of Ireland that splits the country into a north and a south. The initial intention was for both countries to remain a part of the UK, but with devolved governments. But the South rejected this, and from that rejection, the Republic of Ireland is born. Again, missing lots of pieces here of the story, but that's the broad strokes. However, because of the majority Protestant population, Northern Ireland ends up remaining as a part of the UK, but with a devolved government. So this is the case for every other country within the United Kingdoms. They all have these devolved governments that they get in one way or another throughout history. Despite all of that, that doesn't resolve the tension. Still, it still exists. The tensions in Northern Ireland don't just go away because of this, and they end up boiling over again. I mean, throughout the 20th century, but most notably in the 60s. So historians will use a lot of different events to like mark the beginning of what we call the Troubles. That's like the later 20th century iterations of these like violence and guerrilla warfare tactics and so on. But one place we can kind of like locate the renewed boiling point of all of this is with the Catholic movement for civil rights in Northern Ireland. This is kind of what I was mentioning earlier, that Catholics in Ireland during the 1960s, they were calling for an end to discrimination in all the areas that I mentioned before, places like housing, employment, voting, and also the reformation of the police was an important demand. So all of these kind of things were swirling around in the atmosphere. The movement was initially like peaceful and relied on tactics like civil disobedience and marches and so on. Again, drawing on like the tradition of the civil rights movement in the United States. The protesters, however, as you can imagine, as they are everywhere, were met with violence from unionists and paramilitaries, and that was all backed up by the Northern Ireland police. So it's like, I don't know, the state repression had some like extra help, a little extra oomph from the paramilitaries and also the British government as well. So the attacks and police repression then from these like later iterations of the Troubles spun out into other riots, which gave way to more police oppression and so on and so on. In 1969, the Northern Ireland government then started putting in place a peace line to separate Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods. That's what I mentioned earlier when I said that. I mean, these murals that exist throughout the city, many of them are on what are called the Peace Wall and the Solidarity Wall. These are the walls that like physically separated the communities from one another. So that's the context in which you would see some of these things, right, on these walls. So that line ends up being pretty important, right? It's like a physical wall that's used to separate these communities from one another. It's a hard thing to actually describe and see in real life. But as the 70s began, the Irish Republican Army and the Provisional Irish Republican Army and other factions began sort of reorganizing themselves and reorganizing themselves and splintering off from one another. And they would create enclaves in places like Derry. You might have heard of Free Derry in Ireland, which they would, bar.
I've seen the Derry Girls show.
You've seen the show, of course. That's what you need. That's the historical fact right there. But they would basically, I mean, they used the paramilitary forces to like bar the Northern Irish government forces and paramilitaries and British government from entering and, seizing back control. So violence continued escalating throughout the 70s and 80s with a few ceasefires, a few truces negotiated. But the people that were always behind the truces were Catholic and Protestant clergy alike, some of who we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to focus really on the Catholic clergy because they think they played a bit more of a upfront role, but Protestant clergy involved too, an ecumenical seek for peace. And then the official peace talks began in the 90s, and the violence like more or less ended, sometimes less, with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. All of the history is wild, especially as me, like a sheltered American person, who I didn't even know that there still was violence in the 90s when I was alive. So I don't know. That just can tell you how dumb I am and how isolated America is from the rest of the world. But all this history is interesting in and of itself because I think what it shows you is that the lines that are drawn in these conflicts are often expressed in terms of religion. Like, it's always Catholics versus Protestants. And that's true. There's definitely some of that going on there. There's also a lot of other elements at play, though, too, in terms of nationalism and loyalism or unionism, whether or not people in these communities wanted Ireland to be its own sovereign country, its own free state, or if it wanted to remain with the United Kingdom. And I guess what's interesting is that all of these kind of like identities and forces get like really smushed together. And, I was talking to my mom about this whole thing the other day, and she was like, isn't it crazy that people would really just go through all that work to kill each other over religion? And it's like, Well, it's not really why they're fighting, right? There's not like a theological disagreement at the basics of any of this. It's just like one of the many sort of forces sort of caught up in the whole thing. But what's interesting about that, about religion kind of being caught up in the whole thing, is that, well, on the one hand, it lends a whole lot of ways that people use religious identity to organize violence, but also it offers a whole lot of avenues for religious people organizing peace and different types of things there. So I know it's a big story, and I probably told it very poorly. But Dean, what do you think, man? What's your opinion on this whole thing? Is this okay with you?
Wow. Some parts of it do seem okay with me, and other parts don't, for sure. But I think the way that you explained it is very helpful. Good table setting, place setting, context making work. I think, the big thing I always think about when I consider a place like Ireland and what you were just talking about with these religious identities kind of coming along with many other forces and histories and so on is like how much those kind of examples complicate our picture of Christianity in ways that people also don't seem to have fully grappled with. Like, for example, people will be like, Islam is a naturally violent religion, unlike Christianity, which is naturally peaceful. And obviously there's like hundreds of years of colonialism that disprove that, but even the simple kind of unfortunate situations of Protestant and Catholic people killing each other is kind of the, anti-proof, I guess, to that kind of idea. But on the other hand, too, like you said, it also kind of shows the utility and plasticity of those kinds of Christian traditions as well, because not everybody who was a Protestant or a Catholic in Ireland in general was, actively trying to build a sort of violent religious identity either. It plays into these kind of peace talks and means of living together and so on. So I guess to me, that's something I just find like academically interesting maybe about about all this stuff, that it tells us something really bizarre about Christianity, and I think we sometimes iron over all those wrinkles, especially as a church going person or whatever, when the tendency is to like strip away all the material history that comes along with religious identity and focus on the core beliefs or whatever. But when you have a country like that with so much history and so on, you just maybe have to be disabused of that simple story. So I think that is really interesting. And I think the other piece that came to mind as you were relaying all that is the bit that we were just talking about with Grill, that there are these kind of proto-liberation theology movements already happening in Ireland before the 70s and 80s. And I think that's really remarkable to me, because there's something about the pressurizing environments of oppression and exploitation that seems to produce, in at least some Catholic contexts, a really interesting, creative meditation on all kinds of different themes: politics, economics, violence, social justice, peace, whatever. And the fact that you could take a 1968 issue of Grill, as you're talking about, this is like the modern troubles are starting right at this time. You could take that whole issue and put it side by side, a commentary from a handful of priests in whatever, Chile or Brazil or wherever else, and you'd have some very, very similar conclusions without having really obvious, pathways of sharing at that time. Like no formal liberation theology has really started, but they're kind of coming to all the same conclusions. So yeah, that I find really interesting too. The material history impacts religious traditions in a way that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's also worth drawing out too. This is an opinion that I've kind of come across in reading some of this, and maybe we can get to it a bit later. But sometimes scholars of theology, and I guess historical theology and religion, they'll look at like what's happening in Northern Ireland with regards to the peace talks and the ways that Christians were involved in it, and they will draw this out as like a distinction to and against liberation theology, that like the dialogue and the peace process is about something that's not liberation, and I think that's incorrect. I don't think that's right.
Yeah.
If you don't think that like peace talks can be about liberation, then maybe you don't know what liberation is really. But
that's right.
Shots fired. Anyways, I think that what you're saying is true, that there's like a real current of like liberation kind of happening here. That's worth thinking about. Like I think in those terms is actually pretty helpful.
Well, let's think maybe a little bit more about some of the direct connections, and we did find a few. I'm sure also after this comes out, people will have lots more recommendations or things people have found, and we welcome those for sure. I feel like it's a research interest that'll probably keep us busy for a bit. But when I was Googling Ireland and liberation theology, I did find a really interesting, very recent article in the Tablet, which is kind of the UK like progressive Catholic paper. And the title of it is Reconciliation in Northern Ireland is Unfinished Work of Peace from April 2nd of this year. And as you were just saying, we sometimes oppose or counterpose things like dialogue to liberation theology. But I was interested to find in this article, it's kind of a longer, report on some meetings of some bishops and stuff and what's going on in Irish politics. But there's a bishop, Donald McGowan, who said in Derry, according to this article, that the resurrection is the source of the ultimate liberation theology and calls out abuses of power. No wonder, quote, it is unwelcomed in some quarters, for it is a liberating message for those who labor and are overburdened. And goes on to say a lot more stuff just about, social justice and so on. But I think it's interesting that terminology is still kind of alive and well in what is also a tenuous situation in general, or a place with a very recent memory of violence. And working backwards from 2024, where at least it's a sort of phrase that's still being talked about, we did find a few breadcrumbs along the way, maybe you could say. One person that I think Matt already mentioned is this priest, Enda McDonagh. There's others too, a bunch of priests who were interested in this kind of thing, especially in missionary orders. But this guy in particular at least has maybe a stronger paper trail than some of the others, so it's easier to find and identify. There was a book published in 1978 called Ireland, Liberation and Theology. And it's a collection of some essays, and it's kind of a weird collection. It's like this priest has 2 essays in it, and then there's like a government, I think Minister of Foreign Affairs or something, who has an essay in it, which is also kind of interesting, I guess.
There's also like a priest in there from the Philippines as well that I think is actually an interesting connection. But
a bishop, yeah, that's right.
Wild.
Very wild. So it's kind of a weird collection, but the contribution of Enda McDonagh is to basically imagine, is there an Irish theology of liberation, or what exactly would that entail? So maybe we could talk through that kind of essay, or at least pull out a few pieces just to start threading that needle a little bit.
Yeah, sounds good.
Maybe I'll read a couple passages and we can pause and talk about them. So he says, there exists a considerable attraction for Irish people to adopt some models of theology developed elsewhere, and this is what we've been doing. Up to Vatican II, we adopted the models of the Roman schools of theology, but in the wake of Vatican II, we've been adopting these other kinds of models of theology. He goes on to say, what the Latin Americans stress is what happens when they are doing theology, and we have much to learn from them. One of the Latin Americans makes the point that their great advantage was that they had no native philosophy. They substituted an analysis of the social situation and their critical reflection on this in the light of faith. It would again be a mistake to take over their model uncritically, but they have a lesson that we need a theology which is in fact a critical reflection on the basis of the historical process of the people with whom we're dealing, whether you call that liberation or development or transformation. There's a historical development and a historical people and process to whom we belong, to whose service we are called, and it's on that people in that historical process that we ought to be reflecting in the light of our faith. And I think that is actually really interesting to identify that as maybe the key core or key insight of Latin American liberation theology. And I think he's actually right about that there's this, you see it all the time in liberation theologians from Latin America, that they have this really powerful analysis, really impressive kind of stuff. And toward the end, like often I found myself compelled to be like, oh man, I really want to find a way to adapt that to my context. And they are always like, I think in a helpful way, kind of disappointing, because they're like, you can't actually just like export this. You have to do it yourself. You have to like get in a room with a bunch of people and start thinking about your own situation. And that's doing liberation theology. Like it's a kind of hyper localized message. It's like a general message of localization, which I think is interesting. So it's cool to see this Irish priest be like, all right, that's the lesson we're taking. And that means we have to start reflecting on Ireland in particular.
Yeah, exactly. So he's reflecting on Ireland in particular, and like, what would it mean to do theology from the particular historical perspective of Ireland? And he has a lot to say about historical subjects and, whether or not you're an object of history or acting on history. And fine, great, all good sort of philosophizing. But then I think the rubber really kind of hits the road with this essay when he moves on to talking about Northern Ireland. He says that for anybody in Ireland, the most obvious and critical problem that remains is Northern Ireland. It is a problem of life and death, a problem for politicians, for all Christians. And then he kind of goes on to say some more things, but he wants to focus on the paramilitaries that exist there because, and this is quoting him again, they are the people who highlight the problem. They are the most obvious people involved, and I wish to discuss them insofar as I believe they have come out of historical traditions that were designed to serve subjects, to make people subjects, traditions which, because of their stagnation, have rendered those people objects in their political goals and their attitudes to other people, and of course in their political methods. This is a bit of an opaque way of talking, but then it gets very serious pretty quick. They're stuck with a stagnant tradition. It does not seem to me to be a question that can be answered on the moral level, whether what the IRA are doing today is justified in terms of what the people of 1916 did any more than what the UDA did, the UDA or the Unionists, or are doing is justified in terms of what they did to people in 1912. One can see that in 1916 and 1912, an element of the subjectivization of their history which seems lacking today. The paramilitary movement is not leading anywhere in the sense of engaging with divided people and achieving a history for themselves. So I guess what's interesting here is he's recognizing that these movements of history are not they're not liberative. They're not bringing people towards a particular goal that is going to be like a resolution or some kind of glorious sublimation of all of these forces or something, right? It's just sort of like he sees like a dead end, right? It's a spiral of violence is what he's looking at, and he's also kind of recognizing too that that what happened in 1916 or whatever with Easter Rising is kind of different than what's happening now, and he kind of draws out some differences throughout the text. Then he also makes one more clarifying point that I think is actually really interesting with regards to what ends up happening in Northern Ireland in terms of the peace process and the ways that clergy kind of take some of this work up. So McDonough says, it might be worth developing another time how far the churches are slaves of their Catholic or Protestant ethos. Insofar as they have allowed themselves to become the objects of their history and cut themselves off from the primary subjective call to be sons of the Father and brothers of one another. The denominational allegiances in Ireland are not pure faith allegiances. They never could be, but how far they are from the product of a stagnant religious and cultural tradition, which now enslaves, merits serious self-examination on all sides. An Irish theology of liberation would have to deal seriously with the liberation of the churches within their own tradition and the liberation of their theologies. A liberation of such Irish theology as exists may be the first task of an Irish theology of liberation. I think this is such an interesting idea because what he's recognizing is church traditions that are stuck within the political context that they're in, and they can't quite figure out their ways to be out. So he thinks that the first step of the Irish liberation theology is to find ways to liberate the churches from that cycle of violence that the political context that they find themselves in. How do these churches, both Catholic and Protestant, find ways to resolve that social and political tension and work towards something that finally escapes the orbit of the violence that kind of keeps pulling everybody in.
I think also the idea of liberating theology and liberating the churches is a similar insight that you get in a lot of Latin American liberation theology too. For example, Segundo, the great Jesuit theologian, has a book called The Liberation of Theology, which is all on this topic. I'm pretty sure it's based on a course he gave at Union Seminary in New York when he was a visiting professor there for a year or something. All kinds of interesting stuff about it. But in that book, he argues something very similar, and he uses Chile as a test case, although there's a kind of maybe resonant but different critique there where he talks about the experience of the Chilean affirmation of Allende through the movement of priests who were supporting Allende and so on, and then the church turning against the socialist project with Pinochet and the failure of the bishops in particular to really take a side in time and with enough force to prevent a coup from happening and so on. And the point being that religious identity is supposed to be this like really important, big, thick identity, but in fact, when push comes to shove, literal sense, it takes a backseat to like immediate pragmatic and cynical kind of concerns, or I mean, in some cases, maybe just concerns of survivability, even, which are probably more fair and authentic. But in any case, the idea is like theology itself has to be liberated from its willingness to sort of like back down from affirming a process of peace and justice. And it's just interesting to think about that example as compared to this one, where Segundo is reflecting on what turned out to be like a really violent coup replacing a socialist project, and kind of lamenting that theology wasn't really in a place to to build a strong enough opposition, I guess, to that coup, or at least like a thick enough affirmation of the socialist project. I don't really know. It's been a long time since I read the book, but that kind of that kind of spirit is there, I guess. And here in the Irish context, you have like a similar criticism of theology's inability to like solve the problem, which maybe speaks to a bigger question about like how much of this really is a ultimately religious question, or kind of existentially Christian question.
I know that we're like, I've spent a lot of time telling you about the history of Ireland, and now I need to tell you about something else. So I'm going to rush through it like usual. There's a really cool book, a book, maybe it's not really cool. It's a book that I'm interested in by Margaret M. Scull. It's called The Catholic Church and the Northern Ireland Troubles from 1968 to 1998. It's an Oxford University Press book that was published in 2019. It's this scholar's dissertation, and it's a cool one. I think it's actually pretty chonky. It's a big book, and I'm not going to lie and say that I've read it all. But there are a lot of places where she lays out exactly like what were the inner workings and the politics of the church with regards to the Troubles, who in the church denounced violence altogether, who within the church said, maybe the IRA has a few good ideas, but should probably stop blowing people up, and so on, right? But she does have this kind of extensive section, a few different extensive sections actually, about the ways that clergy, Catholic and Protestant, but we're going to talk about a Catholic one here, specifically were like intermediaries and were not quite neutral negotiators, but were negotiators between both the warring like rival factions of the IRA. There's the Irish Republican Army, the official IRA, and there's also another one called the Provisional IRA. So anyways, their clergy played a really like central place in negotiating truces between those like warring factions, which is good. But then also like they played really important roles as intermediaries and more ecumenical and like neutral forces when it comes to negotiating bigger ceasefires between the Unionists and the Nationalists, right? So all these different things are happening. I'm going to read this piece here just as an introduction, and then we're going to talk about a priest in particular called Alex Reed. Margaret Scull writes, throughout the conflict, Catholic priests and many Protestant clergy had acted as negotiators between militant Republicans and their political adversaries, whether they were constitutional nationalists or members of the British government. Priests were supposed to embody neutrality and had historically adjudicated between different Irish groups. For example, priests acted as mediators between the officials and the provisionals. This is the official IRA and provisional IRA in the early 70s, and again between the provisionals and the British government to secure the 1974-75 ceasefire. So many ceasefires, cannot keep track of any of them. The Clonard Monastery and the private work of Alec Reid had brought together Gary Adams and John Hume. These are two different opposing political leaders, culminating in the Hume-Adams peace plan. We'll talk about it later. Don't worry about it if you don't know who these people are. The author here goes on to say, without the work of these priests, many potential avenues for dialogue may have failed out or not opened in the first place. Their efforts to demonstrate that until the mid-1990s, nationalists still valued their services as mediators. Ultimately, it's fairly clear that the work of these priests culminated in the 1994 Provisional IRA ceasefire. I could keep kind of going on. Instead of going on and on, though, I will actually tell you about a really famous picture. Famously a bad idea for a podcast in the audio format. But we've been talking about photography in the last few weeks. Why not bring it back right now? So this guy, Alex Reid, he was a negotiator, a priest in his community. He was a part of the Redemptorist religious order. maybe kind of like the Jesuits, but different. That's what Dean told me. I asked him what that meant, and he said it was like the Jesuits, but different.
Don't tell the Redemptorists I said that.
I'm sorry. I think he said they're like the Jesuits, but better. You can tell the Redemptorists.
Don't tell the Jesuits I said that.
Spreading a lot of misinformation on this podcast about what Dean thinks about these religious orders. But there's a really famous photo of Alec Reed, and I want to talk about it for, I guess, a minute. So Alec Reed, he was a negotiator. He was kind of going between these different factions, these different IRA factions, and then later on, he was kind of involved in the peace process between, like I said, the Unionists and the Nationalists. But there's this really famous image of him, and he is kneeling on the ground. He's wearing his priestly garments and like a jacket over them. And it's a tough image to look at, actually, now that I'm thinking about it and I'm talking about it. But there's a dead soldier on the ground, a dead a British Army soldier, right? Like, that's a big thing. But Alec Reed is kneeling over the body, and he's giving the soldier his like last rites. That's the picture. And it's a It's a gross picture, I gotta tell you. It's, like I said, it's not an easy one to look at, but it's also an image that's used to talk about the Troubles, especially during this time. That's supposed to be like inspirational. It's one that kind of signals a type of compassion and humanity that has like survived, the violence of the moment, and that's a really interesting read on it. Another really interesting piece about this, though, that is maybe unknown or later only found out, but when Alec Reed stopped to give last rites to this this killed soldier, he was carrying a letter from the Provisional Irish Republican Army that was going to the Social Democratic Party in Northern Ireland, that was like helping negotiate a transformation of the situation. This is a pretty big deal because the Provisional Irish Republican Army, they are associated with all kinds of acts of violence and terrorism, and I don't know, people don't like them. Fair. But what's interesting is, out of this relationship that Alec Reed is sort of cultivating through his going between and serving as sort of this like intermediary figure, this relationship is what ends up turning the Provisional Irish Republican Army into Sinn Féin, the Social Democratic Party, right? It's like this is part of the process of getting into the mix with these people, with all these different groups, and like not just saying, I want to keep you all at an arm's length because you're all so bad or whatever, but like actually working for peace. And I think that is actually really fascinating and gives a type of depth to what it means to be a person that's like opening up dialogue a bit more than I don't know, than just like having a nice conversation or trying to tell people to get along, right? He's like he's intervening in the whole situation to his own fate. Like, he could have easily been killed in any of this, but he wasn't, and kind of cultivated this sort of this different outcome because he interjected himself in the middle of it. And he did so too against the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church didn't want him to be involved, and in fact the Catholic Church thought that, especially at this time, that no Catholics should be involved with the idea of nationalism and the violence that kind of came, but also did not speak out against the state repression that was out there either. So a lot of things going on here, but I think a really interesting case for the importance of dialogue and for negotiation, and what that might look like, though, from the lens of a liberationist perspective.
Yeah, it reminds me of so many other situations where the church functioned as an effective mediator. Like, I think of Samuel Ruiz in Chiapas between the Zapatistas and the Mexican state. I mean, he's probably definitely more closely tied into the Zapatistas than it sounds like Alec Reed is here with the Provisional IRA. But you could multiply lots of other examples. And I think it's true. I mean, I think we've probably said it in this podcast before. Dialogue so easily becomes like a way of erasing a lot of genuine differences and kind of toning down a struggle that maybe doesn't need to be toned down, or just kind of as a way of like hand-wringing about anybody doing anything about anything. That dialogue is the way of being like, don't do anything, just be open to talking to people who would rather murder you or something like that. And like, I think that those criticisms of dialogue are fair, and I would make them again. But it's also important to maybe, and I think it is true that to see dialogue as something that could, in fact, be an essential piece of liberation. You know, every post-revolutionary society basically has to figure out how to like talk to itself again, and when it doesn't do that, as most revolutionary situations kind of stop and start on this issue, you see lots of social aberrations and problems, and even inequalities that kind of get baked in, or kind of acceptable levels of violence that are absurd in a revolutionary situation. And the other example I always think of when I think of dialogue is the Sandinistas, that after the revolution was over, they famously abolished the death penalty immediately, with the idea being that the revolution should be able to transform even its enemies into people who could participate in this new society. So all that to say, I think dialogue, there has to be like a liberation theology of dialogue. I don't think people have developed it very deeply, or at least I haven't read it. That's all. But it's examples like that show, it takes like being willing to go talk to the people who are mad enough to do something as like insane and awful as terrorism to also be able to like build a path to peace.
Yeah, totally. I think that's such a good perspective, though, because I mean, the thing that gets people really excited about liberation theology in the first place, I mean, this is maybe not entirely true, but a little bit true, is that, it led to Catholics and to priests and to other religious people like taking up arms and like doing things that were surprising, right? You wouldn't expect. And that is exciting to see religious people kind of getting involved in a revolutionary situation. That is very cool. Not gonna lie, but it is, I think, but there's like this other underside to it that of religious people kind of intervening in the most like horrific situations and the most horrific cycles of violence, and then intervening in this other way to like actually work for peace, but both being liberation.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, Matt, there you have it. When are you going to go back to Belfast, and what's your next big big research assignment?
Yeah,
there?
That's a great question. They might not let me back in after this episode. It might be universally reviled there. No, just kidding. I'm sure it's fine. Not sure. I don't know when I'll go back, but hopefully soon. It's a cool place. There's all kinds of continuing political intrigue there. They've been basically without a government for like 2 years, and only recently has that changed. So maybe there'll be some cool strikes to go on there in the future in the labor movement in Ireland, but who knows? Anyways, thanks for coming to my big, long book report. I hope you had a good time.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can get into our Discord community at 2 Books or More, which is pretty cool. People are always talking about interesting things there, sharing great books, movies, good memes, and the rest of it. You should check it out. Our music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored.